I reached for the bottle again, fingers wrapping around the neck of cheap whiskey that had become my most reliable companion over the past 3 years. The apartment felt smaller every day, like the walls were slowly moving inward. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not when I could see the Pacific Ocean from my window, stretching endlessly toward the horizon, where everything had gone wrong. I once was the best sonar technician the Navy had. 12 years of service, countless missions, and a reputation for hearing things in the deep that others missed entirely. I could read sound waves like sheet music, picking out submarine signatures from background noise with a precision that earned me commendations and the respect of every crew I served with. The ocean had been my second home, her depths holding mysteries I spent my career trying to understand. Now I couldn't even take a shower without hearing those sounds again. The whiskey scorched on the way down, but it dulled the endless ringing in my ears. A souvenir from pressures no human should have survived. I set the glass on the small table next to my chair and looked at the framed certificates covering the wall opposite the window. Distinguished Service Medal, Navy Achievement Medal, Expert Submarine Warfare Pin. All of them felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Someone who still believed the ocean was a place where science and technology could solve any problem. That person died 3 years ago in the Mariana Trench along with 23 of the finest sailors I ever knew. The official report called it a catastrophic systems failure during routine drills. As the Navy claimed, the USS Borealis suffered multiple hull breaches at depth, resulting in the loss of most hands before emergency rise protocols could be implemented. Clean, simple, complete, __, I was there. I heard what we found down there. Saw what no human was supposed to see. The Navy didn't send us out for training. They sent us searching for something they knew was waiting in those depths. Something that had been sending signals up from the deepest parts of the ocean. Signals unlike anything in our databases or textbooks. The ice in my glass rattled as I picked it up again, and I realized my hands trembled. 3 years of therapy, medication, and forced retirement hadn't stopped the tremors that started the day they pulled me out of that life raft. Dr. Patel said it was trauma response, that my nervous system was still processing what happened down there. He meant well enough, but he'd never been 40,000 feet below the surface when something the size of a small island decided to notice you. I tried to tell him what happened during our sessions. Tried to explain about the sonar readings that didn't make sense. The sounds that came from living tissue instead of rock formations. The intelligence behind that massive eye that looked right through our hull like we were made of glass. Dr. Martinez would nod and take notes, but I could see it in his face. He thought the pressure had gotten to me, that my brain had conjured elaborate fictions to cope with survivor's guilt. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was crazy. But crazy didn't explain why the Navy had spent the last 3 years moving me from base to base, facility to facility, making sure I never stayed in one place long enough to talk to the wrong people. Crazy didn't explain why my former crewmates Liam Porter and Ethan Cho had vanished into the military medical system, transferred to different hospitals every time I tried to return them. And crazy definitely didn't explain the non-disclosure agreements they'd forced me to sign. Documents so classified that reading them required security clearance most admirals didn't have. I rose and went to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass. The Pacific Ocean stretched out below, calm in a way that lied in the afternoon light. Somewhere out there, maybe 1,000 miles west, the water got deeper than most people could imagine. Deeper than our best submarines were rated to go. Deep enough to hide things that have been waiting in the dark since before humans learned to build boats. The government knew they were down there. That's why they sent us. I'd spent the last 3 years trying to forget, trying to stitch together something like a normal life in Astoria, where I could pretend to be another veteran dealing with adjustment issues. I got a job at a marine supply store selling navigation systems to weekend sailors who thought the ocean was their playground. I rented this apartment specifically because it faced away from the harbor, thinking the view of open water might help me feel connected to something I used to love. Instead, it reminded me every single day that the world wasn't what we thought it was. The whiskey bottle was getting light and the shadows in the room were growing longer. I'd been sitting here for hours, the same way I did most afternoons, trying to decide whether today would be the day I finally told someone the truth. Not a therapist or a government debriefing officer. Someone who might listen. Someone who might believe that the USS Borealis hadn't died from systems failure. We'd been murdered, sacrificed, fed to something that lived in places where the pressure should have crushed any living thing into paste. Something that had been sending signals up from the deep for longer than our species had existed. The Navy had been tracking those signals for years, maybe decades. And they'd finally decided to send a crew down to make return. They hadn't bothered telling us we were never supposed to come back. I picked up the glass again and noticed it was empty. When had that happened? The bottle was almost done, too, which meant I'd been drinking more than usual. Dr. Patel would probably have something to say about that, but Dr. Martinez had never watched his friends die while something the size of a city moved beneath them in the crushing dark. The apartment felt too quiet, even with the background noise of traffic and distant voices from the street below. The silence reminded me of those moments before everything went wrong. That terrible quiet when our sonar screen showed something impossible rising from the ocean floor. Something that shouldn't have existed according to every textbook and training manual I'd ever studied. I needed to tell someone. Not because I thought it would change anything. The government had made it clear that certain discoveries were too dangerous for public knowledge, but because 23 good people had died for the truth, and they deserved better than being written off as casualties of mechanical failure. Maybe I was finally drunk enough to be honest about what happened down there. Honest about the mission they'd sent us on, the things we'd found in the deepest part of the ocean, and the reason why only 3 of us had survived to see the surface again. I walked back to my chair and sat down, reaching for the bottle one more time. If I was going to do this, if I was going to break every agreement I'd signed and risk whatever consequences came with telling the truth, I might as well start at the beginning. The beginning when I still thought the Navy was sending us out to track Chinese submarines and the deepest thing I had to worry about was maintaining our position without being detected. I walked through the gates of Naval Base Kitsap on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years before everything changed. The salt air felt crisp against my face. And I remember thinking this was exactly where I belonged. 12 years of service had brought me to this moment. Assigned to the USS Borealis, one of the Navy's most advanced Arcturus-class submarines, the technology on board represented the top of underwater warfare, and they wanted me to be their ears in the deep. My duffel bag was light on my shoulder as I made my way across the base toward the submarine piers. I'd packed efficiently, the way you learn to do after years of deployments, bringing only what I'd need for what Captain Mercer had described as a 2-week intelligence operation. Standard stuff. Track Chinese submarine movements in the Coral Sea. Gather signal intelligence. Stay invisible while doing it. The mission I'd run dozens of times before on older boats with less sophisticated systems. The Connecticut sat moored at Pier 4. Her black holes shining with fresh paint. Even tied up to the dock, she looked predatory. 353 feet of nuclear-powered stealth designed to hunt other submarines while remaining undetectable herself. I'd read her specifications during the flight from Mayport, studying every system and capability until I could picture her layout in my head. But seeing her in person was different. This wasn't another submarine. This was the future of underwater warfare. I checked in with the duty officer and made my way aboard, following known corridors that felt different because of their newness. Everything was clean, precisely manufactured, built to tolerances that made the older boats I'd served on feel like antiques. The sonar section was forward of the control room. And when I found it, I had to stop and look at the systems for a moment. The ANBQBQQQ-5 sonar suite took up most of the space. Its screens and processing units arranged in a configuration I'd only seen in training manuals. Passive arrays that could detect engine signatures from hundreds of miles away. Signal processing computers that could isolate and classify returns faster than any human operator could track them. This was what I'd trained for my entire career. The chance to operate systems that pushed the boundaries of what was possible underwater. Impressive, isn't it? I turned to find Elias Park standing in the doorway, a toolbox in one hand and a technical manual in the other. Eli was shorter than me, built like someone who spent his time crawling through mechanical spaces and fixing things that broke under pressure. We'd served together briefly on the USS Hampton 4 years earlier, and I knew him as the engineer who could make any system work. Even when the parts manual said it was impossible. Eli, good to see you again, I said, stepping back to let him into the section. I was getting acquainted with our new toys. Wait until you see what these arrays can pick up, he said, setting his toolbox down near the main processing unit. I've been running diagnostics all morning, and the sensitivity readings are off the charts. We should be able to hear a shrimp fart at 50 miles. I laughed, but I was already thinking about the possibilities. With systems this advanced, we could track multiple returns at the same time while staying completely hidden. The Chinese wouldn't even know we were there until we surfaced back in Opera Harbor with their entire submarine schedule mapped out. Eli opened his toolbox and pulled out a handheld scanner, beginning his pre-deployment inspection of the sonar systems. You met Captain Mercer yet? Not yet. Briefings at 1400. He's been wound pretty tight since we got here, Eli said, running the scanner over a bank of processing units. Been checking and rechecking everything, asking a lot of questions about depth ratings and pressure tolerances, more than usual, even for a new boat. That caught my attention. Pre-mission nerves were normal, but experienced captains didn't usually obsess over basic engineering specifications unless they had specific concerns. What questions? Deep water stuff mostly. How far down we can safely operate. What stresses the hull can handle. That thing. I told him these Arcturus boats are rated for depths that would crush most submarines, but he kept pushing for exact numbers. I filed that information away while Eli continued his inspection. Maybe Mercer was being thorough, making sure he understood his new command's capabilities before taking her into potentially hostile waters. But something about it felt off, like he was planning for scenarios that went beyond standard intelligence gathering. The morning passed quickly as I got to know the Connecticut systems. The sonar systems was better than anything I'd expected. Response times measured in milliseconds instead of seconds. Processing power that could pick out individual engine signatures from background noise with almost perfect accuracy, range, and sensitivity that opened up tactical possibilities I'd never had before. I was adjusting the passive arrays when Owen Price found me. Owen was our navigator, a precise guy who approached his job with the same attention to detail I brought to sonar analysis. We'd overlapped at Naval War College during advanced training, and I knew him as someone who could plot a course through a minefield if the mission required it. "Hale, right?" he said, though we both knew he remembered me perfectly well. Owen liked to be formal until he was sure about the social dynamics on a new boat. "How's the sonar suite looking?" "Like Christmas morning," I said, finishing the array calibration and watching the screens populate with ambient sound data. "I can already hear surface traffic from the harbor entrance, and we're still tied to the pier." "What about navigation systems?" "GPS integration is flawless. Inertial guidance is calibrated to within centime. This boat could navigate underwater for months without ever surfacing for a position fix." He paused, watching the sonar screen cycle through their startup routines. "Of course, the mission brief says we'll be staying in relatively shallow water for most of the patrol. Coral Sea is pretty shallow compared to the deep Pacific Ocean." I agreed. "Should make for easier tracking, fewer thermal layers to deal with." Owen nodded, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Captain Mercer asked me to plot some unusual waypoints during the planning session yesterday. Nothing that changes our basic mission profile, but some of the coordinates were further south than I expected." Before I could ask what he meant, the ship's intercom crackled to life with the familiar sound of the bosun's whistle. "All hands. All hands. Department heads and section leaders to the wardroom for mission briefing. I say again, department heads and section leaders to the wardroom." I secured the sonar systems and made my way aft toward the wardroom, passing crew members I recognized from previous deployments and others who were new to me. 37 sailors total, according to the crew manifest I'd read earlier. A mix of experienced submariners and younger sailors getting their first taste of deep water operations on a frontline boat. The wardroom was larger than what I was used to, but it still felt crowded with 15 department heads and senior petty officers gathered around the central table. Captain Mercer stood at the head of the table, a stack of folders in front of him, and a large chart of the Southwest Pacific Ocean displayed on the bulkhead behind him. Mercer was taller than I'd expected, with perfect military posture and graying hair cut to regulation length. His uniform was spotless, pressed to sharp creases that looked like they could cut paper. But what struck me most was how he acted. Eli had been right about the tension. Mercer's jaw was set in a way that suggested he was working to keep his expression neutral, and his eyes kept moving around the room like he was checking to make sure everyone was paying attention. "Gentlemen," Mercer began, his voice carrying the authority that came with commanding nuclear submarines in hostile waters. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the secret level of access. Our mission will take us into the Coral Sea for intelligence gathering operations against Chinese naval forces." He pointed to the chart behind him where red pins marked various locations scattered across the region between Vanuatu and New Caledonia. Intelligence shows increased Chinese submarine activity in these areas over the past 6 months. Our job is to track their patrol patterns, identify their operational protocols, and gather signal intelligence on their communication protocols. Mercer picked up a red marker and began drawing on the chart, outlining areas of operation and transit routes. We'll be operating the Connecticut in passive mode for the majority of the patrol. No active sonar, minimal communications, strict electromagnetic silence except for scheduled check-ins every 48 hours. This was exactly what I'd expected to hear. The mission I'd trained for throughout my career. Trail hostile submarines without being detected. Gather intelligence without revealing our presence. Return with actionable information about Chinese naval capabilities. Standard Cold War tactics applied to modern geopolitical realities. Hale, Mercer said, looking directly at me for the first time. Your sonar expertise will be critical for this operation. I need you to identify and classify every return we encounter with particular attention to submarine signatures that don't match known Chinese vessels. Understood, sir, I replied. The Connecticut's passive arrays should give us excellent detection range and classification capability. Mercer nodded, but I noticed he was checking his watch again. A quick look that seemed almost automatic. Park, I need detailed reports on all engineering systems throughout the patrol. Pay special attention to hull integrity monitoring and depth gauge accuracy. Eli looked slightly puzzled by how specific that request was, but he nodded. Yes, sir. These Arcturus boats are built for deep water operations, but I'll keep close tabs on all structural systems. Price, navigation will be crucial. I want precise position fixes at all times with backup systems ready for immediate activation if primary GPS becomes unavailable. The briefing went on for another hour covering how things worked, communication rules, and backup plans. Everything sounded routine. The detailed planning that came before any successful intelligence mission. But something about Mercer's talk felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script that didn't match how he normally spoke. When the formal briefing ended, Mercer sent most of the group away, but asked me to stay behind. I waited while the wardrobe emptied, leaving the two of us with the chart of the Coral Sea and the stack of classified folders. Hale, Mercer said, his voice lower now that we were alone. I reviewed your service record before requesting you for this mission. 12 years of submarine service, expert qualification on 4 different sonar systems, commendations for detecting returns that other technicians missed. Thank you, sir. I take pride in my work. Mercer was quiet for a moment, studying the chart behind him like he was memorizing details that hadn't been covered in the briefing. This mission may require you to push your systems beyond normal operating parameters. Are you prepared for that possibility? The question struck me as odd. Passive sonar systems were designed to operate continuously without significant stress on the systems. Unless we were planning to go deeper than standard patrol depths, I couldn't imagine what parameters he was referring to. Sir, the Connecticut sonar suite is rated for all normal submarine operations. What specific parameters are you concerned about? Instead of answering directly, Mercer checked his watch again and gathered up the classified folders. Be prepared for anything, Hale. This patrol may not follow standard protocols exactly. He left the wardroom without further explanation, leaving me alone with the chart and a growing sense that this mission involved more than tracking Chinese submarine movements. I studied the red pins marking our expected operating areas, trying to understand what Mercer hadn't told us during the briefing. The coordinates looked routine at first glance, covering shipping lanes and naval operating areas where Chinese submarines would logically conduct patrols. But when I looked more closely, I noticed something that hadn't registered during the presentation. Several of the southern pins were positioned near areas where the seafloor dropped away into deep water, places where the continental shelf gave way to depths that went down thousands of feet below our normal operating envelope. I walked back to the sonar section, thinking about Mercer's questions regarding depth ratings and systems parameters. The Connecticut was capable of diving deeper than most submarines in the world, but standard intelligence missions didn't require extreme depth operations. We'd be tracking surface returns and shallow diving submarines, staying well within the comfortable operating range of any modern boat. Eli was still working in the section when I returned, running final diagnostics on the sonar processing computers. "How'd the briefing go?" "Standard intel mission," I said, settling into the operator's chair and watching the screen cycle through their self-test routines. "Track Chinese boats, stay invisible, gather signals, intelligence. Anything unusual?" I thought about Mercer's behavior during the briefing, his specific questions about depth capabilities, and his cryptic warning about pushing systems beyond normal parameters. Maybe. Captain seems more nervous than usual for a routine patrol. Eli finished his diagnostic sequence and closed the access panel he'd been working on. "Well, this is his first mission commanding the Connecticut. New boat, new crew, operating in potentially hostile waters. I'd probably be nervous, too." That was logical, but it didn't explain the feeling I'd had during the briefing that Mercer was holding back important information. Maybe I was reading too much into normal pre-em mission tension, projecting my own excitement about operating advanced systems onto a captain who was being thorough. The afternoon passed in routine preparation activities, final systems checks, inventory verification, last-minute coordination with shore facilities. By evening, the Connecticut was ready for departure. Her nuclear reactor providing power to systems that buzzed with quiet efficiency throughout the boat. I spent the last few hours before we got underway running passive scans of the harbor area, getting familiar with the sonar signature of local traffic and calibrating the arrays for optimal performance. The systems responded better than anything I'd ever operated, providing clear, detailed information about returns that would have been barely detectable on older systems. Before midnight, Captain Mercer gave the order to cast off lines and get underway. I watched on the sonar screens as the Connecticut moved away from the pier and out into Puget Sound. Her reactor providing silent propulsion that left almost no acoustic signature for potential listeners to detect. We were beginning what I believed would be a routine intelligence patrol, tracking Chinese submarines with the most advanced underwater surveillance systems in the world. I felt excited about the mission, confident in my abilities, and proud to be serving aboard one of the Navy's most capable boats. I had no idea that Captain Mercer had already received orders that would take us far from the Coral Sea into depths where no submarine was designed to operate. Hunting for something that had nothing to do with Chinese naval movements and everything to do with signals that came from places where the ocean floor dropped away into darkness deeper than any human had ever explored. I was running final calibrations on the passive sonar array when the message notification appeared on my personal terminal. 2 days into what should have been a routine intelligence patrol and we'd gotten into the familiar rhythm of deep water operations, the Connecticut moved through international waters with the silent efficiency that made Arcturus-class boats the top predators of the submarine world. The message was encrypted, marked with security protocols I'd never seen before. When I decoded it, the sender identified himself only as J, and the content was brief. Report to Captain Mercer immediately. Bring no materials or documentation. I secured my sonar station and made my way toward the captain's quarters. Passing crew members focused on their routine duties. The submarine felt different than it had during our first day at sea. More settled, more purposeful. We'd left behind the coastal traffic and commercial shipping lanes entering the deep Pacific Ocean, where the only sounds were the subtle vibrations of our own machinery and the distant biological noise that populated every ocean. Mercer's quarters were located behind the control room, a small private space that served as both office and sleeping area for the boat's commanding officer. I knocked twice and heard his voice call for me to enter. The captain sat behind a narrow desk bolted to the bulkhead, reading from a tablet computer that displayed what looked like navigation charts. His uniform was perfectly pressed even after 2 days at sea, and he'd kept the same tense attitude I'd noticed during our departure briefing. When he looked up at me, his expression was carefully neutral. "Close the door, Hale." I pulled the door shut and stood at attention, waiting for him to explain why I'd been summoned. Mercer set the tablet face down on his desk and studied me for a moment before speaking. "We've received new orders from Naval Intelligence. Our mission parameters have changed." That caught my attention right away. Mission changes were unusual during submarine patrols, especially when we'd been at sea for less than 48 hours. The Navy typically planned operations with enough detail to avoid mid-course corrections unless something significant had happened. "Sir, what change?" Mercer picked up a message form from his desk, looked at it quickly, then set it back down. "We're no longer going to the Coral Sea. Instead, we've been told to investigate something unusual at coordinates within the Chromatic Trench." I felt my eyebrows go up. The Mariana Trench was hundreds of miles south of our planned operating area and far deeper than any intelligence mission I'd ever heard of. Standard submarine patrols avoided extreme depth operations unless there were compelling tactical reasons to risk the systems and crew. "What anomaly, sir?" "That information comes from Mason Greer, a superior whose authority supersedes our original mission. I don't have details about the nature of the anomaly, only coordinates and orders to investigate using our sonar capabilities." The name Mason Greer meant nothing to me. In 12 years of submarine service, I'd learned to recognize the names and reputations of senior officers throughout the underwater warfare community. Harrison didn't fit any category I knew, which suggested he operated outside normal naval command structures. "Sir, I'm not familiar with that name. What's his position?" Mercer's jaw tightened a bit and he checked his watch in that quick way I'd noticed during our briefing when we left. "Harrison works under Naval Intelligence with permission. I'm not allowed to question. His orders are classified above what I can access, which means we follow them without talking about it." Something about Mercer's tone told me he wasn't totally comfortable with the situation either. Military officers were trained to follow orders without hesitation, but experienced commanders also developed gut feelings about when missions went beyond normal limits. This felt like one of those moments. "What are my specific responsibilities for this new mission?" Prepare the sonar systems for extreme depth operations. I need maximum sensitivity and range from our passive arrays with particular attention to detecting anomalous signals that don't match known geological or biological signatures. I thought about the system specifications I'd memorized during our transit from Astoria. The Connecticut Sonar Suite was designed for deep water operations, but extreme depth introduced complications that pushed even advanced systems toward their operational limits. Water pressure affected sound transmission in ways that required careful calibration, and the acoustic environment at abyssal depths contained interference patterns that could mask or distort return signatures. Sir, how deep are we talking about? The systems will need specific calibration depending on our operating depth. Mercer looked at the message form again, reading coordinates that meant nothing without reference to depth charts. The anomaly is located at approximately 35,000 feet below surface level. 35,000 feet. I had to process that number for a moment to make sure I'd heard correctly. That was deeper than Mount Everest was tall. Deeper than any submarine was designed to operate safely. The Connecticut's hull was rated for depths that would crush most boats, but 35,000 feet approached the absolute limits of what our pressure vessel could handle. Captain, that's extremely deep for submarine operations. Are we certain our hull integrity can handle that pressure? Park has assured me that the Connecticut specifications include a safety margin beyond our normal operating envelope. We won't be staying at depth longer than necessary to investigate the anomaly and gather required intelligence. I wanted to ask more questions about the nature of this anomaly and why it required such extreme measures to investigate, but Mercer's demeanor suggested the conversation was moving toward conclusion. He gathered the message forms on his desk and secured them in a locked drawer. Hale, this information is classified at levels that require absolute confidentiality. No crew member outside this room is to know the specific nature of our new mission. If anyone asks about our course change, we're pursuing a high-value intelligence target that requires investigation. Understood, sir. Begin preparations immediately. I want those sonar systems optimized for deep water operations within 6 hours. We'll be changing course after the next scheduled communication window with Fleet Command. I left the captain's quarters with my mind racing through the technical requirements for recalibrating our sonar arrays. Extreme depth operations required adjustments to every aspect of the system: frequency selection, power output, signal processing algorithms, even the physical alignment of the passive arrays to account for pressure-induced hull deformation. Walking back toward the sonar section, I passed Eli Park coming out of the engine room. He looked up from the technical manual he was carrying and nodded in my direction. Hale, how's the sonar suite performing? Perfectly so far. I need to talk to you about depth operations. What's the Connecticut's actual operational ceiling? Eli's expression became more serious, and he glanced around to make sure we weren't overheard by other crew members. Officially, we're rated to depths that exceed any tactical requirement. Unofficially, I've been running stress calculations since we left port. And Captain Mercer's questions about extreme depth capabilities have me concerned. What calculations? Hull compression ratios, pressure differential limits, emergency ascent capabilities from various depths, the analysis you do when someone's planning to push a boat beyond normal operating parameters. I thought about the coordinates Mercer had given me and the problem that supposedly needed investigation at 35,000 feet below the surface. If we had to operate at depths approaching the limits of our hull design, what would you need to monitor? Eli closed his technical manual and looked directly at me. Everything. Hull stress indicators, pressure systems, emergency ballast controls, backup life support systems. Are we talking about a specific scenario here? I wanted to tell him about the mission change and the coordinates we'd been given, but Mercer's instructions about keeping things secret were clear. Eli deserved to know what stresses his engineering systems might face. But I couldn't share classified information without permission. Theoretical planning, making sure I understand our capabilities if we encounter situations that require deep water operations. Eli didn't look entirely convinced by my explanation, but he accepted it with the professionalism that came from years of submarine service. Well, theoretically, these Arcturus boats are built to handle more pressure than we'd ever encounter in normal operations. But extreme depth isn't about hull integrity. You've got to consider acoustic performance, navigation accuracy, communication capabilities, and emergency protocols that might not work the same way under crushing pressure. What about sonar performance at those depths? Sound transmission changes significantly as water pressure increases. Your passive arrays should still function, but you'll need to recalibrate everything to account for pressure-induced acoustic distortion. And depending on the thermocline layers at depth, you might lose range and accuracy compared to standard operating conditions. I made mental notes about the technical challenges I'd need to address during the sonar recalibration process. Eli was right about the complexity of deep water operations. Every system on the submarine would face stresses and environmental conditions that pushed beyond normal design parameters. Thanks for the input. I better get back to my systems and start running diagnostics. Eli nodded and continued toward the forward torpedo room, leaving me to walk the rest of the way to the sonar section alone. I was thinking about the conversation with Mercer and the mysterious anomaly that required investigation at impossible depths. Something about the entire situation felt wrong, but I couldn't identify exactly what was bothering me. The sonar section buzzed with the quiet efficiency of electronic systems operating at peak performance. I settled into the operator's chair and began pulling up calibration menus, preparing to reconfigure the systems for extreme depth operations. The process would take several hours of careful adjustment, testing each component to ensure optimal performance under conditions we'd never encountered before. As I worked through the technical protocols, I found myself thinking about the encrypted message that had started this chain of events. Mason Greer, whoever he was, possessed enough authority to redirect an entire submarine mission with a single communication. That level of influence suggested connections to intelligence agencies or military commands that operated outside normal Navy hierarchies. The Connecticut began a subtle course change sometime during my third hour of sonar recalibration. I felt it in the slight change of the boat's motion. The way our forward momentum adjusted to a new heading that would take us south toward the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean. Other crew members would notice the change and start asking questions about our destination. But Mercer had prepared a cover story about pursuing high-value intelligence targets. I wondered what anomaly existed at 35,000 feet below the surface that justified such extreme measures to investigate. Geological formations didn't typically require submarine reconnaissance, and no biological organisms were known to exist at depths where the pressure would crush any living tissue into paste. Maybe we were tracking a foreign submarine that had managed to operate in the deep ocean, or investigating wreckage from an experimental vessel that had exceeded its operational limits. By evening, I'd completed the sonar recalibration and run diagnostic tests that confirmed the systems was optimized for deep water operations. The passive arrays showed enhanced sensitivity at the frequencies most likely to penetrate the acoustic environment we'd encounter at extreme depth. Signal processing algorithms had been adjusted to account for pressure-induced distortion, and the screen systems were configured to highlight unusual returns that didn't match known acoustic signatures. Owen found me during the dinner hour carrying navigation charts and looking concerned about something he discovered during course planning. "Hale, we're heading towards some pretty deep water." The captain asked me to plot coordinates that put us right over the deepest part of the Mariana Trench. "What's the depth at our destination?" Bottom contours show abyssal plains that drop away to more than 36,000 feet below sea level. That's deeper than any submarine is designed to operate safely. I thought about the strange coordinates Mercer had given me and realized we were approaching the exact location where something had been detected that required investigation by naval intelligence. Owen was right about the operational risks. Even the most advanced submarines couldn't safely operate at depths where the water pressure approached 1,100 pounds per square inch. Maybe we're transiting through the area to reach our actual patrol zone. Could be. But the waypoints I've been given suggest we're planning to spend time there. Multiple position fixes, loitering patterns, the navigation planning you do when you're investigating something specific rather than passing through. Owen spread his charts on the table between us, pointing to the coordinates that marked our apparent destination. The area was hundreds of miles from any major shipping lanes or naval operating zones, isolated in the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean, where the ocean floor dropped away into trenches that represented some of the most extreme environments on Earth. "Have you heard anything about what we're supposed to be looking for out there?" I wanted to tell him about the mission change and the anomaly we'd been ordered to investigate, but Mercer's instructions about confidentiality prevented me from sharing any details. Owen deserved to know why we were heading into dangerous waters. But I couldn't violate direct orders from the captain. Nothing specific. Orders change sometimes during submarine patrols. We'll know more when we get there. Owen looked unhappy with my non-answer, but he accepted it and picked up his navigation charts. "Well, I'll have exact position fixes ready for whatever we're planning to do down there. Hope the systems can handle the depth." After he left, I sat alone in the section thinking about the questions that had been building throughout the day. Mason Greer's authority to redirect our mission. The coordinates that placed us over the deepest part of the chromatic trench. The anomaly that required investigation at depths no submarine should attempt to reach. Mercer's obvious discomfort with orders he couldn't question or discuss. I returned to the sonar station and began running final checks on the systems I'd adjusted for extreme depth operations. The systems worked perfectly, displaying acoustic data with the clarity that made the Connecticut one of the most capable surveillance platforms in the world. Tomorrow, we'd find out what anomaly existed in the crushing darkness 35,000 feet below the surface, and whether our advanced technology could detect and classify something that had attracted the attention of mysterious superiors with authority beyond normal naval command structures. The descent began 12 hours later when Captain Mercer gave the order to take the Connecticut deeper than any submarine in our fleet had ever gone. I watched the depth gauge climb past our normal operating ceiling. The numbers increasing with a steady persistence that made my stomach tighten. 15,000 feet, 20,000, 25,000. Each 000 feet added another layer of crushing pressure against our hull. Water that wanted to compress our submarine into a metal pancake the size of a dinner plate. The sonar screens showed clean readings as we dropped through the water column, but I kept adjusting the calibration settings I'd spent hours perfecting. At these depths, sound transmission changed in ways that challenged everything I'd learned about underwater acoustics. The ocean itself became denser, more resistant to the passage of sound waves, requiring constant fine-tuning to maintain the best performance. Hull stress is approaching yellow zone parameters, Eli called out from his engineering station, his voice carrying across the control room with professional calm that didn't quite mask his underlying concern. "Captain, we're getting close to operational limits." Mercer stood behind the periscope housing, hands clasped behind his back, watching the depth gauge with the same focused attention I'd seen during our departure briefing. His uniform remained perfectly pressed even after hours of submarine operations, but I could see tension in the way he held his shoulders. "Keep descending," Mercer ordered. "Monitor hull integrity, but maintain current rate." I heard Eli take a sharp breath, followed by the sound of him adjusting control settings at his station. The Connecticut was built to handle extreme pressure. But we were entering territory that pushed the boundaries of even Arcturus-class engineering. Every rivet, every weld, every seal in our pressure vessel now carried loads that went beyond normal design specifications. The submarine's interior filled with subtle sounds I'd never heard before. Creaking noises that seemed to come from the metal structure itself. Tiny pops and groans as our hull compressed under the mounting pressure. These weren't emergency-level sounds, not yet. But they represented the boat talking to us in a language that said we were operating outside our comfort zone. 30,000 feet. My sonar screens continued showing empty water below us. The acoustic void you'd expect in the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean. No biological returns, no geological features, the endless dark that stretched down toward the ocean floor still miles beneath our position. I made minor adjustments to the passive arrays, keeping them fine-tuned for maximum sensitivity as we approached the coordinates Harrison had provided. "Navigation systems are showing some drift," Owen announced from his station, tapping his screens with the precise movements of someone trying to troubleshoot systems that wasn't responding correctly. "GPS return is getting weaker, and inertial guidance is requiring frequent corrections." That wasn't surprising at our current depth. Navigation systems depended on systems that worked best within normal operational limits. The further we pushed beyond those limits, the more likely we were to run into unexpected problems with electronics made for standard submarine warfare rather than deep ocean exploration. 32,000 feet. I found myself checking and rechecking my sonar calibration, making sure the system stayed properly set up as water pressure continued building around us. The acoustic environment at this depth felt different from anything I'd experienced. Denser and more resistant to sound transmission. My passive arrays still worked perfectly, but they were working harder to maintain the same level of sensitivity I'd expect at normal patrol depths. "Hale, what's your sonar picture showing?" Mercer asked, moving closer to my station without taking his attention off the depth gauge. "Clear water, sir. No returns above background noise level. We're still approximately 7,000 feet above the coordinates you provided." Mercer nodded, but didn't respond immediately. I could see him calculating distances and descent rates, probably trying to determine exactly when we'd reached the position where this mysterious anomaly was supposed to exist. Whatever we were looking for had been detected by someone with enough authority to redirect our entire mission. But so far, my system showed nothing but empty ocean. 35,000 feet. Eli's voice cut through the control room with a sharp edge that made everyone pay attention. Captain, hull stress indicators are entering the red zone. We're approaching maximum safe operating depth for this vessel. I looked up from my sonar screens to see Mercer's reaction. His jaw tightened slightly and he checked his watch with that quick involuntary movement I'd noticed during our mission briefings. But he didn't give the order to level off or begin emergency rise protocols. "Keep descending to 38,000 feet, Mercer said, his voice carrying the authority of command, even though I could hear the tension underneath. "Then we'll reassess our position." Eli's protest was immediate and professional. "Sir, that depth approaches the absolute limits of our pressure vessel design. If we encounter any structural compromise at that depth, emergency rise protocols may not be sufficient to prevent total failure." Noted. Continued descent. I watched Eli's hands move across his engineering controls, adjusting systems to handle pressure loads that pushed our submarine toward the edge of what was physically possible. His technical expertise told him we were entering dangerous territory. But Mercer's orders left no room for discussion or delay. The creaking sounds grew more frequent as we went down past 36,000 feet, not the sharp crack of failing metal, but the continuous conversation between our pressure vessel and the crushing environment that surrounded us. Every structural component was now carrying loads that represented the upper limits of what our designers had calculated as survivable, 37,000 feet. I made final adjustments to my sonar arrays, optimizing them for maximum performance at depths where no submarine was supposed to operate. The passive sensors continued functioning flawlessly, but I could feel the ocean pressing against us with a weight that seemed to want to squeeze our tiny metal bubble into nothingness. Then, at 38,000 feet, something appeared on my screens that made me forget about hull stress and structural limits and every other concern I'd been tracking during our dive. "Return," I announced, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Bearing 270, range approximately 2 miles, depth, approximately 40,000 feet." Mercer was beside my station before I finished speaking, leaning over my shoulder to look at the sonar screens. Classification. I looked at the return signature, trying to make sense of readings that went against everything I knew about underwater acoustics. The shape was huge, easily the size of a small island, but it showed up on my screens with the acoustic characteristics I linked with living tissue rather than rock formations or man-made objects. "Unknown, sir. The signature doesn't match any geological formation in our databases, and it's too large to be any known vessel or marine animal." But even as I said those words, I was noticing something else about the return that made my hands start shaking slightly as I changed the sonar controls. The acoustic signature wasn't static like a mountain or seamount would be. Instead, it beat with a regular rhythm that carried through the water with enough power to register clearly on our passive arrays from 2 m away. "Captain, this return appears to be pulsing regular intervals, approximately 12 seconds between peaks." The rhythm reminded me of something I couldn't quite place at first, a biological pattern that felt known, even though it came from something impossibly massive. Then I realized what my mind had already picked up on, and the understanding hit me like cold water flooding through a broken hull. It sounded like a heartbeat. "Sir, recommend we investigate closer," Mercer said after studying my screens for several seconds. "Take us down toward that return." Captain Eli's voice carried across the control room with barely controlled alarm. "We're already at the absolute limits of safe operation. Descending further risks catastrophic structural failure." Mercer's response was immediate and final. "Continue descent. We need to determine the nature of that return." I felt the Connecticut angle downward, her ballast tanks adjusting to carry us deeper into water that wanted to crush us like an empty beer can. As we went down, the pulsing signature grew stronger and more distinct on my sonar screens. Each rhythmic beat sent through the ocean with such power that I could feel it vibrating through our submarine's hull. This wasn't random geological activity or systems malfunction. The pattern was too regular, too consistent, too powerful to be anything except biological. But nothing alive could exist at these depths where the pressure would compress any known life form into paste within seconds. "Navigation systems is malfunctioning," Owen announced, his voice tight with stress. "Compass readings are erratic, and inertial guidance systems are showing impossible drift patterns." I kept my attention on the sonar screens, watching the huge return grow larger and more clear as we got closer. In 12 years of submarine service, I'd looked at thousands of acoustic signatures from every category of underwater object. Ships, submarines, whales, rock formations, even experimental vehicles that pushed the boundaries of underwater technology. This matched nothing in my experience or training. The rhythmic pulsing continued with mechanical precision. Each beat strong enough to vibrate through our pressure vessel and into the metal framework that surrounded us. Whatever was making this acoustic signature had more power than any biological organism should be able to produce. As we went down past 39,000 feet, getting close to the source of the pulsing, I realized we weren't investigating a rock anomaly or tracking a foreign submarine or examining wreckage from some experimental vessel. We were getting close to something alive, something impossibly, incomprehensibly large that existed in the crushing darkness where nothing should be able to survive. 40,000 feet below the surface. My sonar screen showed something that challenged every assumption I'd held about life on Earth. The return wasn't a geological formation or wreckage from some experimental vessel. It was alive, and it was rising from the deep ocean floor toward our position with deliberate, purposeful motion that sent massive displacement waves through the water around us. "Contact is ascending," I announced, my voice barely steady as I watched the acoustic signature expand across my screens. Rate of climb approximately 500 feet per minute. The numbers didn't capture what I was seeing on the sonar screens. The creature's body stretched across miles of ocean floor, larger than any land mass I'd ever mapped during 12 years of submarine service. Glowing patterns pulsed along what appeared to be its exterior surface, creating light signatures that registered on our passive arrays as distinct acoustic events. Mercer moved closer to my station, his hands gripping the back of my chair as he studied the screens. "How large is this return?" I recalibrated the sonar range twice before answering, unable to believe the measurements my systems was providing. "Sir, based on acoustic signature analysis, the return measures approximately 3 miles in length and nearly 2 miles in width." Depth. The creature appears to extend down beyond the range of our sonar penetration. The words sounded impossible even as I spoke them. Nothing that large could exist in Earth's oceans, let alone at depths where the pressure would crush any known biological structure. But my sonar systems was functioning perfectly, providing detailed readings that confirmed the presence of something alive moving through the water beneath us. The creature's ascent created powerful currents that began affecting our submarine's position and attitude. I felt the Connecticut move sideways, pushed by massive water displacement that our ballast control systems couldn't compensate for adequately. "Engineering report," Mercer called out, his voice carrying new tension as he felt the boat's movement change. Eli's response came from across the control room, edged with controlled panic. "Captain, we're getting weird current patterns that don't match any ocean models. Something down there is moving enormous amounts of water." As the creature rose toward our position, more details became visible on my sonar screens. The glowing patterns weren't random biological stuff, but organized structures that pulsed in complex sequences, creating sound signatures that looked like nothing in any database I'd studied. The patterns seemed to follow mathematical progressions like a language made of light and sound transmitted through the crushing darkness. 35,000 feet, 30,000, 25,000. The creature's massive shape filled my screens completely, now rising through the water column with movements that created sound waves powerful enough to vibrate through our pressure vessel. Each pulse sent tremors through the submarine's metal framework, creating frequencies that made the entire boat buzz like a struck tuning fork. Then, at 20,000 feet below our position, the creature's rise stopped. For several seconds, the only sounds in our control room were the quiet buzz of electronic systems and the increasingly frequent creaks from our compressed hull. The massive return held its position in the water column, no longer rising, but maintaining perfect neutral buoyancy in a way that suggested conscious control rather than passive floating. "Sir," I whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might attract the creature's attention. "The return has stopped descending. It's holding position directly below us." Mercer leaned over my shoulder to look at the sonar screens and I could feel how tense he was. "What's it doing?" Before I could answer, something appeared on my screens that made my hands start shaking. A section of the creature's huge body was changing, rising upward from the main mast like a mountain growing from the seafloor. The acoustic signature showed organic tissue moving with clear purpose, reshaping itself into a structure that reached toward our submarine. "Captain, part of the creature is it's extending something toward our position. Range is decreasing rapidly." The extending appendage measured hundreds of feet in diameter, larger than our entire submarine, moving through the water with smooth movements that belonged to something perfectly suited to the deep ocean environment. As it got closer, I could see more detail in its acoustic signature. Complex internal structures that pulsed with the same rhythmic patterns I'd been tracking for hours. 15,000 feet below us, 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet emergency rise, Mercer ordered, his voice sharp with command authority. "All ballast tanks, emergency blow. Get us to the surface now." Eli's hands moved across his controls with practiced efficiency, triggering emergency protocols designed to bring the Connecticut to the surface as quickly as possible. I heard the roar of compressed air forcing water out of our ballast tanks. Felt the submarine's nose angle upward as we began an emergency rise. But the creature's massive presence had changed the water conditions around us in ways that made normal submarine operations impossible. Instead of rising toward the surface, we found ourselves caught in a powerful downward current that pulled us deeper even with our emergency ballast protocols. "Ascent systems are not responding," Eli announced, his voice tight with professional calm that couldn't hide his growing alarm. "We're being pulled down by current patterns that don't follow standard oceanographic models." The creature's long arm kept rising toward us, and I realized with growing fear that what I was seeing on my sonar screens was only a tiny part of something incredibly huge. The main body stayed miles below us. So large that our systems couldn't figure out its edges, while this single arm was big enough to swallow our submarine completely. 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet, contact with extending appendage in 30 seconds, I announced, watching the range close with mechanical precision on my screens. Mercer grabbed the submarine's communication system. All hands, prepare for impact. Emergency stations. Emergency stations. The first return was gentle, almost delicate. The creature's appendage brushed against our submarine's hull with the careful touch you might use to examine a fragile object. But even that gentle return created acoustic signatures that registered on my sonar screens as massive structural vibrations. Then I saw something on my screens that made me forget about submarine operations, emergency protocols, and everything else I'd learned during 12 years of underwater warfare. Part of the creature's extended appendage was opening, revealing an internal structure that measured larger than a football stadium. And within that structure, looking directly at our submarine through 40,000 feet of crushing water pressure, was an eye. The eye was perfectly formed with organic complexity that suggested intelligence beyond anything I'd encountered in nature or military service. It focused on our submarine with clear awareness, studying us with the same careful attention a scientist might give to bacteria under a microscope. The pressure of being watched by something so vast and intelligent hit me harder than the physical water pressure surrounding our hull. This wasn't a mindless deep-sea creature or some basic organism adapted to extreme environments. The intelligence behind that massive eye was old, powerful, and completely alien to human understanding. Jesus Christ, Eli whispered from his engineering station, his voice carrying across the control room in the sudden silence that had fallen over our crew. The creature's look at our submarine went on for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds. I watched its eye move with careful precision, tracking along our hull from bow to stern, taking in every detail of our construction and design. The glowing patterns along its body pulsed faster now, creating complex light sequences that seemed to be processing information about our presence. Then the creature began to move again, and our situation changed from impossible to catastrophic. The massive appendage that held us started to contract, pulling our submarine deeper into the creature's grip with unstoppable force. Our emergency ballast systems were completely useless against the downward pressure created by something that could displace ocean water by the cubic mile. Hull stress indicators are redlining, Eli called out, his voice rising above the groaning sounds that now filled our submarine. Captain, the pressure vessel is approaching failure parameters. I felt the Connecticut's metal framework beginning to buckle under forces that went way beyond every safety margin built into our design. And someday they'll decide that their period of watching is complete. The cold pressure of the deep stayed constant as we moved, the mission unchanged and the stakes unchanged. If you love chilling horror stories and eerie mysteries, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us every week for a new descent into darkness. Your next nightmare is just one click away.